Prime Minister says he hopes an agreement on how Australia should come out of the wages pause will be reached at the Economic Summit opening in Canberra tomorrow.
Politics, trade unions, business and industry.
The role of the Economic Summit called by Bob Hawke in 1983 has been a bit lost in the mists of time. Interwoven in history with the economic deregulation he and Paul Keating pursued, and with the Wages and Incomes Accord the Hawke government struck with the trade unions. But the then PM had a very clear idea of what he wanted the summit to achieve.
I'll just wait a couple of minutes.
Mr Hawke set the conference 6 ambitions.
The conference is now back in session.
Hawke wrote in his memoirs that the idea of the summit was of, quote, uniting the country around commonly agreed values and goals on the basis of a shared understanding of economic realities. And it was the physical manifestation of his 1983 campaign slogan, reconciliation, recovery, reconstruction.
If a genuine consensus is to emerge, it must mean an understanding on the part of all sections of the Australian community of the constraints they will be called upon to accept and the contribution they will be called upon to make to the process of national reconciliation and national recovery and national reconstruction.
To put that summit in context, Australia had come out of a period of particularly bitter political and economic divide, the dismissal of the Whitlam government, a Fraser government confronting a still powerful union movement amid massive industrial disputes in an era of high unemployment and inflation. The purpose of the summit was to reframe the national conversation. In fact, to start a more cooperative national conversation.
I think I'd have to say surprising elements to those of us who hadn't had tremendously close dealings with the ACTU and the union side before.
What I would suggest is that we should break for morning tea now.
Back in '83, we'd just gone through nearly a decade of consistently high unemployment, high inflation, and fierce industrial confrontation.
2 bells will go? 2 bells will go, I think, about 5 minutes before resumption time.
Hawke was able to persuade them that all of the important solutions required cooperations between parties who'd been in conflict with each other.
Captains of industry, union leaders slapping each other on the back.
The trade unions represented a majority of the labour force in those days. They were very strong, and it was leading to an unusually high wage share of national income. We've now got the opposite.
Okay, everyone. How are you going?
Good. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese moves towards his own summit next week with a very different mix of economic problems. Instead of high wages, inflation and unemployment, the problem is low wages and low unemployment, but inflationary pressures growing. There is one powerful point of similarity between the two summits, though, the quest for full employment. Anthony Albanese first pledged in July last year to commission a white paper on full employment, to be informed by a job summit.
This masks a tough reality. It will draw together experts from across government, industry and the union movement to set out a plan for how we will reduce unemployment and underemployment.
The economic problems have changed in the intervening years, but so too have the power and influence of the economic players. For example, in 1983, the unions represented over 50% of a very different, still industrialised workforce. Now it is less than 15%. Wages were set by the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. Subsequent changes were supposed to have moved bargaining to individual businesses, but that system has now broken down.
It's become too complicated to use. Employers have worked out how to game the system and manipulate the systems through the use of lawyers. No one's really signing up to new agreements. There's a lot of agreements which have lapsed, which means that workers are still covered by agreements, but employers aren't obliged to pay pay rises each year.
The government last month outlined some of the issues to be discussed at the summit, like migration, barriers to work, and the need to create more secure work. In other words, all issues about the workforce. But the ACTU has been pushing a much more extensive agenda in the lead up to the summit that covers tax, climate change and the role of government, to name just a few. But the core business will be fixing the enterprise bargaining system, a long-time goal of the unions and, for that matter, business. The ACTU's aim is more workers being able to bargain with several employers at once or across a whole industry, rather than what is supposed to happen now, that workers bargain with their boss in individual workplaces.
Tony Burke, the Industrial Relations Minister, has said he will introduce legislation before the end of the year. He's really at this stage got a blank canvas around what would be the changes that would be made in relation to enterprise bargaining, but he said bargaining is on the agenda.
That blank canvas puts the nature of this summit into stark relief.
Option C, proposing a capital gains tax, a consumption tax and big cuts in income taxes.
While there have been summits over the years when a government has tried to get support for a particular policy, notably the 1985 Tax Summit, which unsuccessfully sought endorsement for a consumption tax, it seems this summit is much more like that 1983 summit, where the aim was to get a broad consensus on the problems the country needed to address.
While we've got union coverage of the labour force so much smaller than it used to be, we probably can't swing things back as far as some people would want to, simply because of the different institutional arrangements. We'll have to think more broadly. We'll have to think about reform of taxation and public expenditure in various ways. The solutions won't look the same now as they did back in the 1980s.
I think it's about getting some consensus and getting some momentum about the need for change. Getting both sides as such, the employers and unions, out there on the record, away from behind closed doors, get the issues ventilated so they get into the public's mind, and maybe people will get a better understanding of what needs to be done.